Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for staying here. We're going to end up this symposium with this last session. We would like to have like an informal, very informal conversation with Dore Ashton. And we would like to invite you also to make any questions, any remarks that you feel liking to do. Above all, yeah. I would like to, well, Dory doesn't need to be introduced, and I would like to just start with a little question. We were talking yesterday about Sweeney, James Johnson Sweeney. Dory knew him very well, and maybe we could, I don't know, ask her about her recollections about the exhibitions that he did in New York, about how he managed to have Spanish artists included in many of the shows he was mounting in the Guggenheim or elsewhere.
Well, I think I'll start. I like anecdotal history. I'll tell you a little anecdote. There was a Congress. I remember it was 1960 because my first child was born the next year. And we went by bus, if you can believe it, from Paris to Poland.
Wow.
So I got to know Jim Sweeney much better than I had known him in New York when he was an august personage. And I forget which city it was in Poland, they made a great celebration. And I love to dance, still today. And there was a lot of dancing, and I stayed out very late. But so did Laura and Jim Sweeney. And around 4:45 in the morning, Jim had a booming voice. I hear this booming voice say, "Laura, it's time to go to Mass." That's who Jim Sweeney was. That's my.
And we were talking yesterday about his Catholicism, his being Catholic. Well, this is much of it. Mm-hmm. And do you think that, his consideration, his reckoning of Spanish artists was something that made really a difference in New York scene, like how he liked Tapies or Guerrero or Chillida?
Not only Spanish artists, but he was the only urban thinker at that time when I started. He was the only one who thought that there was any place else in the world. I'm afraid this country still smells of that kind of chauvinism, including in your field. And you'll forgive me. And nobody says your field too? No?
I was thinking of it, but anyway, I didn't dare.
Well, what I wanted to say about Jim was he, after all, had a wild youth in Europe. And he was very well known. I encountered people who knew him when he was young there, when I went to Europe finally. He was well known as a literary man. He began as a literary man, which to my mind made him a lot more civilized than most art historians and critics. Mm-hmm. And I learned, I have to say, I learned a lot from Jim. We talked literature quite a lot when we were alone together. And the thing I think that distinguished him from the other museum types that we had at that time in New York, except for Alfred, I'll say that.
Alfred Barr?
Except for Alfred. Alfred was an immensely civilized human being, and I'm afraid very badly treated by that institution. I'll never forgive them for it. Even still today, I don't like to go in there because of that. Besides which, what they've done to it is horrible, isn't it? Yeah. I think most of us would agree about that. So my feeling about Jim was that he was someone who stormed into our city and brought the high standards, which we at that time thought of the high standards of good old between the wars Europe to New York City. There was nobody else like him that I knew of, at any rate. There were others who were well educated in their fields. But Jim was a civilized man. He knew a lot about a lot of things, and especially about literature, as I said. So you could depend on him if you wanted to have a real conversation, to have a range of reference, and I learned a lot from Jim. He also had a sense of humor. I mustn't forget to say that. You could make a joke and he'd laugh, whereas a lot of art historians don't know what a joke is. I mean, well, at any rate, those are some of the things that I think of when I think of Jim. Plus, he was, as you all know, an immensely adventurous human being, just as a human being. And I don't know if you know the story about how he brought the Olmec head back to New York City. Did you ever,
No.
Incredible. Which is documented. It's not just his side of the story I'm telling. He took himself to Mexico, to the jungle. He was as he told me, he was on a raft which sunk. He had to swim to shore. He had all kinds of adventures in the jungle to get that Olmec head out of the depths of the jungles in I don't know what part of Mexico, pretty far down, I suspect, and to drag it back to New York City. And he did all that himself. He didn't depend on peones to do it.
Peones?
No.
And I was thinking also, he was well, I don't know if it was crucial, but he was influential in having tapies well respected in New York. You told me that you met Tapies when he first exhibited in New York.
The first time, yeah.
Can you tell us
You
about that?
wouldn't have liked the paintings. I didn't. It was before he discovered himself. And he showed those little funny figures, those little pseudo-surrealist things.
Martha Jackson Gallery?
That's it. Oh,
Yeah.
bravo, you get an A. Yes, and he came. Yeah. And as you know, he was a very good-looking man.
Yeah.
So I got to know him very fast. And I found him. We were instantly friends, and we were friends for the rest of his life. And
Yes.
as I told you, and Eusebio Lázaro and I did a film 2 weeks before he died. So there is that record, and I'm so glad about that. It's a very nice film, too. I'm proud of it. And he at the very end, that was maybe 2 weeks before he died, he still, when we spoke 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish, and he still, when I said something that interested him, I looked in his eyes, and they were the eyes of the one that I had met in Madrid 50 years before, more than 50 years before. And that's a story, too, which I'll just... my generation, I grew up with an uncle who, when I was 5 years old, made me collect silver foil for the Republicanos in the Spanish Civil War. So we didn't go to Spain. We boycotted Spain. But I had to go to Spain, for God's sake. I had to see Velázquez, Goya, what? And moreover, we had a concept which we called then, there were people we called interior refugees. Later we talked about people in South America that way. So we already talked about interior refugees, and some of us felt that we should go to Spain and visit interior refugees. And the ones I visited were Saura and Tapias. And I don't remember how I knew about them. Somebody told me, right? And when I got to Spain, being an American, when I realized, and I can read Spanish, I could then too, and
Would that be like in the 50s or?
19. Oh gosh,
50s,
I'm not good at dates. I forget. Before they left Spain. When did they go? When did they leave?
They went for Paris, like in the 50s. So,
56
yeah.
or something. It was before that. And but somebody must have told me in Paris about those two young artists, and I made my way there. And I had I've told you that, Lola, I'll tell the audience. Instantly, I had a Franquista experience in Madrid. I was walking across the Diagonal, and my foot was on the white line. So two Guardia Civil, they came up to me and they said to me, your foot's on the, in Spanish, of course, your foot's on the white line. And I said, but it was still on the line. And one of them turned to me and they said, Señora, aquí no se disputa. Well, it's funny, but believe me, that's the Spain I discovered. Every minute was like that. Aquí no se disputa. And I then thought it was my obligation. I was glad I'd done it. It was my obligation to find those artists that hadn't been able to get out yet. Most of the ones that I was interested in did eventually get out and went to Paris, and in one or two cases to New York. But it was a very, what shall I say, impressive experience for a little ignorant American girl. You know, I was fairly young then, in my early 20s, to encounter that kind of.
And you did go to the Prado then, if you had to go to see Velázquez?
I did, and
Goya?
you know what? The Franquistas were really bad. There were pails on the floor. There were leaks in the Prado. And they had pails and water dripping into the pails. They were the first time I ever saw the Prado. And I couldn't believe it. I came from New York, from the Metropolitan Museum to the Prado. I mean, you'd never find a pail in the Metropolitan Museum.
But what did you think about the Velázquez and Goya or Greco that you saw there?
Well, you can imagine. I mean, you know, we were all, you know, in tremendous awe of the Spanish painters. They were the ones. And as you probably have read in books, all of the artists that they now have the label abstract expressionists, or as I called them, the New York School, all of them were aficionados, absolutely, of Spanish artists. The biggest influence on all of them, and not just Jackson Pollock, but every single one that I knew. That's who they knew.
What do you think they saw in the Spanish school, in the so-called Spanish school?
Passion.
Did they like it? Passion?
I think so. I mean, I don't know. That's vulgar, but I can't think of any other word that would really cover that situation. That they felt it. They didn't think of it. You said, what did they think of it?
It was not a matter of thinking, it was a matter of feeling.
They felt it. They felt it. And I felt it too.
And then, what about Picasso and what about Miró for them?
Well, I have to come there to say that no one, my generation on or before, in the 20th century in the United States, not one artist could avoid Picasso. They could go around him, they could go behind him, they could go through him, but they couldn't avoid him. And that was a great cross to bear for those artists. I mean, you know, they'd catch each other. So I was told when I would listen to anecdotal history, and they'd catch each other, you know, say, Yeah, that Picasso did that, you know. It was a real problem. And you must have talked to Jose Guerrero about when he was young in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me how that when they heard that he was from Spain, all they wanted to do was talk about Picasso.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is
And when they heard he was from Granada, all they wanted to talk about was Lorca.
yes.
Also, yeah.
Lorca, yes, that's true. They were obsessed with Lorca. But after all, Lorca spent time in New York.
Yeah.
And and I think he wrote a poem about New
Yes,
York.
yes.
So, and
exhibition
we
now.
all knew that.
Yeah, there's an exhibition now in the New York Public Library about that.
There is?
Yes.
See, she has to tell me. I'm a New Yorker. I'll go instantly.
You have to go.
The day after
You'll
tomorrow.
love it. You'll love it. And what
That's
about
wonderful.
Miró? What about Miró?
Well, you know, Miro came to New York.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Picasso, you know, he wanted to come to New York. I guess you all know, we wouldn't let him in.
Yeah.
We didn't let commies in.
He was a communist.
Yeah, it was, can you imagine? Oh, what a country. Well, I mean, you know.
Yeah, but at the same time, he was hailed like the hero of modern art by the Museum of Modern Art.
Absolutely. Alfred
As
Barr
Miriam was saying, that was more complicated than that. Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, in this conversation about Barr today,
Yeah.
Barr was, no question about it, the source of all information in this country about Picasso, because his enthusiasm was boundless. And he had, informally, I don't mean in his publications and not the book, but he had real insights about Picasso's. It's amazing for an Anglo-Saxon
Yeah.
to have understood a Spaniard that well. I was really impressed with Alfred about that. And also, as I was saying before, Alfred was a very shy man, and he found it really, it was agonizing for him to have to address an audience or you know, and if you could sit him down very quietly, if you wanted. So one day, when I was working on that little book I did, Picasso on Art,
Oh, yeah.
I asked Alfred if he would receive me and if he could help me with any papers or anything like that. And he took me into his office, which by that time they were punishing him, and they had put him in an office about the width of this table. And he took me to the office and he just opened the file. And he said he had to go someplace, and he just left me alone with all his precious papers. I mean, that's the kind of
Generous,
man he was.
yeah.
Oh, yes, he was an amazing man, really much underesteemed, I think, and should have had many more honors. Right? You agree? Good. And you know, that whole thing about the North Americans and their evolution, the big character there is Arshil Gorky.
Yeah.
No question about it. And when I was young, I would meet old artists who would like to reminisce about going to Gorky's loft on 14th Street. I live near it now. It's still there, you know, but they didn't do anything with it. 6th Avenue and 14th Street, and the reverence in the atmosphere of the studio, all of them said it was to Picasso.
Of course.
And one of them once told me that when he said something negative about Picasso to Gorky, Gorky hit him. You know?
But Gorky is a very peculiar case because he did his own parkour in art history.
Yes.
And he started looking at Cézanne, then he went to
yeah.
Picasso,
Yeah.
and then he said, and naturally I'm with Miró now.
I'm with
He was having his own
Yes.
itinerary.
Well, one of the reasons is that Miró came to New York.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and so to us, Miró wasn't this great, mysterious European genius because he'd been in a nice city.
Yeah, he was a person.
And, I had a couple of occasions to talk with him alone, and I found him very hard to talk to, by the way. I didn't get much out of him, but he was very sweet. He was very, very nice, a gentleman.
We were talking yesterday. You remember we were saying that in the end, Miró was always un señor de Barcelona.
Yes.
He was like always very, very polite and
Absolutely.
very
Absolutely, and other people told me the same.
Yeah.
That the last time I saw him was in that famous place outside of Paris. I think it was Louis Carré arranged for us to go to the place where you dine in a tree. Well, I forgot what it's called. That's very famous. It was famous in the 19th century, and it was still there. And Louis Carré arranged for me to go with Miro for lunch in a tree. Well, it's appropriate, I guess, right?
well.
So, and he could be more informal, but you had to arrive there.
Mm-hmm.
And people told me that all the time in Paris, that, they'd have a big party, and he'd sit like this for an hour or two.
Yeah.
But sometimes somebody would find something that interested him to say, and then he was voluble. He talked a lot, apparently. Not to me, but unfortunately. Although I did interview him. He did. Carré made him do it,
And what about this idea that was supposed to be so generalized, both in Spain and also outside Spain, as we saw in the Frank O'Hara's text for the new Spanish painting and sculpture exhibition, and also for the Sweeney exhibition, the idea that Spanish abstraction was the consequence of a whole history tracing back to Velázquez, Goya, El Greco. What do you
like that theory?
What do you think about that?
I have no idea. My experience of artists is that they're not, quote, influenced.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right there when you want them to be for your art history thesis or whatever. No,
this idea of ancestry lines that they traced at that time, and that was it was in every single text at the time.
Everything, yeah, and even I to this day tell my students, please don't use the word influenced by in your papers, because they can get away with everything that way, and it's, after all, it's only one way of organizing things.
Yeah, exactly. But that's what we're talking
I wanted to
about.
read you this quote from Rubén Darío.
Sí.
Modern society builds a Tower of Babel in which everyone understands everyone else. I think that that's absolutely true, and that we just pretend that there are all these divisions, but secretly we understand.
Of course.
So, the history of the, at least the two art forms that I know best, painting and sculpture, you can't do that, You have to behave.
It can be looked from anybody, from any country or any
But we
place.
mentioned Gorky before, and
Yeah.
one of the anecdotes that I heard from several people about Gorky, because I, of course, didn't know him, I wasn't around then, was that he was absolutely obsessed with Picasso, as you know.
Yeah.
And one evening, he gathered all his friends around, and they sat on the floor in his studio, and he talked for 3 hours about Picasso. And everyone that I met that was there remembered it. It was such an extraordinary lecture that he gave, and such a loving lecture, obviously. And he used to take Bill de Kooning to the Metropolitan Museum and explained paintings to Bill. Bill told me that himself. And de Kooning, if you ever knew him, and if you brought up the word Gorky, he would practically weep with the importance of that man in his life as an artist.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of important to remember
Yeah.
in the reception. And then the other thing that you have to remember is that when Guernica came to the United States, it traveled. It was, I don't know in how many cities, I didn't do my homework, but it was, I do know it traveled all over the United States and then part of Latin America, didn't
Yeah,
it?
and Sweden and many other places.
Yes, so it isn't as if it were a cult item. It was seen by many, 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 many people, and not only artists. So that, you know, it was certainly part of my culture. I was born into a culture which was familiar with Guernica.
Yeah.
And with lots of other Picasso because of Alfred Barr's obsession with Picasso. And the first museum I ever went to, I was 9 years old, was called the Museum of Modern Art. And the first things I saw were Picasso, of course. And Alfred did a good thing. I wish that they do that in the Prado. He put that Guernica in a room almost its size, hardly larger. It was in that little enclosed space, and behind, he put the drawings behind your back. Mm-hmm. That was the best way I've ever seen Guernica. I've seen it 3 different places since, and that was perfect. And they should think about that. Manolo's gone, right?
Manolo's gone.
Why didn't I think of that before? He wouldn't do it anyway. Manolo's stubborn.
And did they talk about Guernica, about the impact of Guernica or the meaning, or, I mean, what do you have any?
Every single inch of that painting somebody had a theory. When I started listening, I couldn't, it was bewildering. Every inch, there wasn't the tiniest detail, down to a guy that I knew, a young guy, maybe my age at that time, maybe 22, 3. He had investigated the sword. The history of that sword. I mean, come on. It was like that. It really was.
There are so many articles and books and.
Oh yeah.
So I don't know if there was something else that you would like to mention, or maybe we can just open the question for the audience.
Well, there's been, to me, a singular absence in all of this. The name René Darnoncourt.
Yes.
And the fact that he spent a number of years in Mexico City with the refugee artists who one another ill. Does anybody want to say anything about that? The absence occurred here, and did you know René? I'm sure.
The what?
René Darnoncourt. Did you know René Darnoncourt?
Yes, I did.
Can you?
Such an absence of his presence.
Yeah, I don't know if you can.
The audience has to hear. René was about 6 feet 9 inches tall, really big guy, but gentle as a lamb. And I was really surprised when he got killed by being hit very lightly by an automobile. I mean, that was crazy. Such a big guy.
Do you have any memories or something about his work in Mexico with Mexican refugees?
No, I was not important enough to really engage René in conversations. I knew Alfred better, much better, and so I heard about anecdotal history. I heard a lot about René, and he, of course, all of those people at MoMA were in awe of him. including Alfred.
Maybe you can say something. Because maybe you know something that is interesting for us to know.
I mean, I just the standard information about the time he spent in Mexico.
Okay.
Wasn't that so?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I'd forgotten that. You're right. Breton was there. That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
In general, the Surrealists were intellectually very, very important in New York City, and partly for their literary knowledge, but also because they brought news from Europe. And, in New York City, we were a dependency of Europe until quite recently.
Dory was the curator. I modestly wrote a little essay. Yes?
My question would be,
I didn't hear you. Say it again.
That he said that since you curated the exhibition of Rebours,
Yes.
Tapies and Saura were represented, you said,
by Martha Jackson
by Martha Jackson and Pierre Matisse as gallerists.
Yes.
and both were collected
And-
by the book.
In the U.S.?
Well,
Certainly Tapias did. I don't think Saura did. I never noticed any strong impact in artist studios of Saura's work, but Tapias immensely. I mean, there were dozens of young painters that saw the first show. I don't mean the first show at Martha's because
That was the first Tapies.
that didn't interest them at all. But when he came out with the abstract paintings,
62. He had a huge exhibition
it
in
was
62.
Yeah. Well, from that day on, he was he was a visitor in everybody's studio, and they did pay attention. Yes, they did, and I think you could go through an exhibition of works from the 60s and 70s, from New York City at any rate, and you'd see the touch.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
echo, or the touch.
Oh,
yeah.
yes, sure. Yeah.
Eugenio. Parece que ya hay micrófono.
Wait,
Espera,
they're giving
espera.
you the, yeah.
Both with Carmen Jimenez, did a revelational exhibition about Julio Gonzalez.
Yeah, Picasso and
And I think Julio Gonzalez is in this symposium quite absent. I like to speak something about it.
Yeah,
About working with Carmen?
No, with Carmen, no, about Julio Gonzalez.
you and me were working with Carmen in the Picasso and the Age of Iron
Yes.
exhibition. And yeah, Eugenio was originally willing to talk about Julio Gonzalez, and then he left it away. And he would like to talk about.
About,
The Age of Iron.
yes,
Shows the relationship between Picasso and Julio Gonzalez.
yes, well, at the very origin of the exhibition
But then
was the
David Smith-
idea that after all, it all came, that part came from Gonzalez.
20 years after,
Mhm.
what you thinking about Julio Gonzalez? Julio Gonzalez now.
I mean, what do you feel now about Julio Gonzalez? Do you think it was so
It's
influential?
been a while since I've seen an exhibition of Gonzalez, but my memory of Gonzalez, I was very impressed, very impressed. But of course, it's quite interesting that many of us were, what shall I say, affected by emotionally affected by the Spanish pavilion in the 1939 World's Fair. And, as you know, Montserrat, that sculpture,
Yeah.
was there. And that's the first I knew of Gonzalez. I didn't know about all that interesting stuff that I found out when Carmen did that show in the Guggenheim. I just had seen photographs of that. And also, I did go to the World's Fair with my daddy, but I was just a little girl, so I didn't look at art. Naturally, I wanted to go on the rides. And so I didn't remember it, but there's so many photographs of it that I feel as though I've seen it. That was our first introduction to Gonzalez. Most of us, including people like me interested in the field, hadn't ever seen an exhibition of Gonzalez. And I didn't see the work until I went to Paris, which I did in my early 20s. It was a long time before we got around to acknowledging Gonzalez here, and a long time before the art historians began teaching the students as if he mattered,
Yeah.
which is also interesting.
What is interesting, it was also an American sculptor who first paid attention to Gonzalez was David Smith, who said that
Absolutely.
he was the first master of the torch. Yeah.
Yes, right. I'd forgotten that.
Yeah.
Yeah, David was.
Classify. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, and you know, he wrote a couple of nice things, Gonzalez. They were published in the artist's newspaper during the Depression, the WPA newspaper, and all the artists read that religiously. I mean, it was before my time, but they told me that, you know. So it wasn't as if he weren't known, but first known as a poetic writer. That's how they knew him. And sometimes they would point it out to me that people kept the first catalog they ever had of Gonzalez. Yeah, you probably can.
It's another example of how tempos works differently, and because he was doing not cubism, but something related to cubism when, you know, later than the so-called cubist period, or he was doing this kind of other chronology. Huh?
Yeah, plus their idol, Picasso, went to take lessons from Gonzalez, and they heard about it immediately. There was an amazing grapevine, I'm telling you.
Yeah, this is true. Is there any other questions that we would like to ask Dore?
I would like you to talk about, for our revelational essay for Miss, Picasso and Fraunhofer.
Yeah.
Picasso what?
Fraunhofer, le chef d'œuvre inconnu.
Le chef d'œuvre inconnu, oui.
What do you think now about this impossible artist doing an impossible masterpiece like a metaphor of modern art?
Fable of modern art, yeah.
Well, you know, no author ever knows what they really made up and what really was, right? Did I make that up? I don't know. But it's certainly, sorry, I shouldn't be so, what is the word, facetious? I should be serious like a real professor. But I don't even have a PhD, so it's all right for me not to be serious. Right? So, but I have 3 honorary ones. As I told somebody today, I don't accept them anymore. You know why? Because they expect a free lecture.
No, but anyway, yeah, it's a very interesting question. What would you say now about this idea of an impossible artist making an impossible masterpiece, as the fable of modern art. I mean, as the...
Well, as you know, I've thought a lot about that, and most of the artists that I've known personally in my lifetime and sat around and drank wine in the studios, they found the whole enterprise impossible. And I've never known a painter, for instance. I know painters better than I know sculptors. I never knew a painter who was ever really satisfied with what he or she had done. And, you know, or when somebody would call up and say, come on over, I'd like to show you something. And you'd know instinctively that they were worried that it was no good, right? And I was always very delicate in those situations, because you could throw a guy or a woman down for weeks with the wrong response. You had to be very, very sensitive to that sort of thing. And I found that most painters, at least, and one or two, David Smith had the sensibility of a painter, and you could talk to David about anything. I mean, David was a smart guy, and he knew what was going on in the world, and he cared, and he knew a lot about painting. Although I think he was a bad painter, but he knew a lot about how to look at paintings. And you know, I guess you've all read that stuff, but de Kooning and Gorky and David Smith and people like that spent a lot of time in a rather nice museum called the Metropolitan Museum, which I still spend time at. And you'd be surprised the people you run into there. That when they had an opening last year of something or other, and I did go. I don't usually go to openings, so somebody asked me, an artist asked me to go. And we got there, it was just packed with the usual suspects, right? You know, and that's how it's always been in New York City, of my time at any rate. And I think, you know, that it goes without saying that when you live in a city with a great museum, you're lucky. And, you know, you can go back again and again and again. And as I sometimes tell my students, you know, I would find some painting. Well, when I was a graduate student, not for very long, at Fogg Museum, and once in a while we would go into Boston, to the Boston Museum, and there was a little painting that I loved in that museum. It was by Giovanni di Paolo. You know how long that kind of thing lasts? 3 weeks ago, a student gave me a paper about Giovanni di Paolo, and my heart thumped. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
It's true. It's a true story. And she looked at me. She was so surprised.
There's another painter that we haven't, almost we haven't touched, is Motherwell, and also very interested in Spanish culture.
Well,
In the, of
do you
course, the
mind
Spanish
another
Republic.
anecdote?
Yeah, I will, and I love another anecdote.
Oh, well, when I did the big Motherwell exhibition at the Reina Sofia,
With Manolo, of course.
with Manolo, yes, of course. And it was, yes, Manolo had it first in his museum.
In the Tapies Foundation in Barcelona.
Yes, yeah. And I didn't know the custom in Spain. We don't do that here. They didn't tell me until the last minute that I was expected to take the princess and the prince through the exhibition on the opening evening, whilst the whole of Madrid stood outside on the sidewalk waiting for me to take them through the show. And I was so shocked. You know, I come from America, right? We don't do that.
No.
So I took this, I'm going to try to be polite now about the prince. He was tall and good looking, he had not enough of chin, but otherwise. Anyway, she was kind of nice, the princess. The first thing that happened was she said, "Is the artist here?" Well, he was long since dead, and I was embarrassed, and I said to her, "What? He's dead. What do you call her, princessa or something? Whatever you call her." They told me what to call her, but I forgot. What do you call
Alteza
her?
or something like that.
And the first two paintings I had hung happened to be two of the
Republic.
Spanish Civil War paintings.
Elegy to the Spanish Republic.
Elegy to the can. They were both called Elegy to the Spanish Republic. So the princess, asked me about the paintings, and I knew it was a bad moment, and so I had to try to find something to say. So I said, well, the artist felt sad about the Republicanos during the Spanish Civil War, and these paintings show his sadness. And the prince turned to me and said, in Spanish, of course, but my Spanish is so bad, "Señora, Spaniards are a happy people. They are not sad." That in Franco Spain, right? So that was my first adventure with how things really were in España, right? Well, sort of.
But what did Motherwell say about Spanish artists or about Spanish literature? You remember talking with him about
Yes,
that?
of course. He was of that generation for whom the Spanish Civil War was the event, and they, of course, were Republicanos, and they did things like, I was 5 or 6 years old when my uncle, who was 10 years older than me, asked me to collect tinfoil from cigarette wrappers for the Republicanos in the Spanish Civil War. So, it was very much with us. And of course, as you know, we sent quite a number of boys to the International Brigade, almost none of whom came home. I think I heard once there were 4 out of I don't know how many dozens of boys that went that made it back. And I met one of them when I was in university, and he was the local hero of the local progressive kiddos. And if you were I went to the University of Wisconsin, and if you knew the people interested in progressive politics, they'd say, "Oh, you should meet," well, I forgot his name. He's a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, a Republicano. And then I did meet him, and he was impressive. He really was. And he was the one who told us, and that's how I found out how few came home. I don't know why that was, but...
And Motherwell had a direct
so
impact
Motherwell was in university during that period, and as you know, he came from a banking family, and he was always embarrassed, and it was really hard to be a painter amongst other painters if your father was a banker. So he tried to hide it, and so he was keenly interested, and he was educated,
Yeah.
and he kept up with the world news, as you know. So he followed what was happening in España, and he was very, very...
he was also keen to Spanish literature.
And also very much so, and anybody that came into contact with him. And also he taught at Hunter College for a while, I don't know for how long. And I once saw his syllabus. It was filled with Spanish literature. He was obsessed with that, as well we know. I mean, he did how many of those paintings, for God's sake,
Yeah.
all about the Spanish Civil War. So for us, the Spanish Civil War was not such an alien affair. It was with us, and we grew up with it. And people like me who went to a progressive university, there was always some professor that was teaching about the Spanish Civil War, and we all took that course, so.
Well, I don't know if there's anything or any other question. Maybe we could just close this session here, and thank you for being here today.
No, thank you. Thank you. Okay, good.